From Lighthouse Reports, this is Backlight. Every month, we take you behind the scenes of real-world collaborative investigations.
We're your hosts, impact producer Tessa Pang
and investigative reporter Beatriz Ramalho de Silva.
Hey Beatriz, I miss you. It's been like a week. I'm getting separation anxiety.
I know, we just had a very fun and productive work week in Athens with all our team, and it was great to be your flatmate, Tessa. We had a good time.
Exactly. And we got to eat breakfast together every morning on the balcony and work together during the day. And of course, see all of our other amazing colleagues that we actually don't get to see that often. And we have these kinds of work weeks twice a year, I believe. Yeah. And it's just a great opportunity to get to spend some FaceTime with everyone, but also get to work on our investigations together too.
Yeah, and it was a busy work week for a lot of people in the team. We had an investigation that came out in the War Winners newsroom, and then our Desert Dumps investigation was being finalized that week. So it was like going through that in person together, which I think is helpful.
Exactly. Yeah. We actually had 2 investigations being published the very next week. And one of the reasons for this big time crunch was because of the looming European elections, which when you're listening to this podcast, I think will be this week. And I guess in general, elections are a really big moment for impact for public interest journalism because it combines the opportunity to get revelatory findings that change the way people think about big issues at a time where they're most likely to be paying attention to politics, and combines it with the opportunity to elect a whole host of new people that have the power to carry through those mandates. So they're kind of big moments that we wanted to center these 2 investigations around.
Yeah, so that's why today we're going to be talking to one of our directors and editor of the Borders newsroom, Klaas van Dijken, and our lead food systems reporter, Lei Win, on 2 investigations that we just published. One of these investigations is from our Borders newsroom, and it essentially tries to answer the question of how Europe spends its money to reduce migration where it thinks nobody is looking in North Africa. So this is an investigation that looks at Mauritania, Tunisia, and Morocco, where we find a system which dumps Black people in the desert whilst allowing Europeans to talk about human rights.
Yes, and the other investigation is from our food systems newsroom, which basically picks up from the farmer protests that swept Europe and continue to be a huge and divisive issue across the continent. And in this context, we dig into how these farmers' demands are being kind of translated from these on-the-ground movements into the decision-making spaces. And we kind of question who is speaking for farmers in these spaces, and therefore who controls the future of farming, and therefore how we eat. And the investigation looks into the kinds of groups representing farmers and who they actually speak for. And a little spoiler, it's rarely the actual farmers themselves. And we'll make sure to link both of those investigations in the show notes because they are out already.
So we'll be speaking to our colleagues, Klaas and Thin, about what these investigations found and also about the strategic thinking that goes into them and how they can reveal really important truths to the public that are crucial in holding powerful institutions accountable. So we're going to cover a bit how we go beyond publication to get our findings to voters and policymakers.
Yes, because after all, 2024 is the year of elections, so hopefully this conversation won't only be useful to journalists in Europe, but also journalists globally who are hoping to engage the public around elections this year. So let's dive into it.
Hey, Klaas and hey, Finn. It's really cool to have you guys on the podcast today.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having me.
So we're just going to kick things off by asking you each a little bit about the inception of both the investigations we'll be speaking about today. So maybe I'll start with you, Finn. Can you talk me through a little bit the beginning of the union's investigation and what were the main questions at the time that you wanted answered?
Yeah, sure. So, last year we did this investigation into a group called Kopa Gojeka. Beatriz, you were involved in it, and Tessa, you were too, actually. In fact, you just joined Lighthouse, so both of you were involved in that investigation. Now, Kopa Gojeka is the oldest and most powerful farming union in Brussels. And we found out that, they said that they pretty much represent all farmers in Europe. But we found out that unfortunately they don't. They represent only a small subset of those farmers, mainly big ones, and not the smaller scale farmers, more environmentally friendly farmers that a lot of the European farmers tend to be and European consumers support. So this was a natural progression from that investigation, which looked at Copa Cogeca at Brussels level and some of its member unions at national levels, to then go a little bit deeper into some of the very, very important agricultural countries, agricultural economies in Europe. So that's France, Italy, Germany, and Poland. But of course, with the farmers' protests that began around the end of last year in most of European cities, and the parliamentary elections, the European parliamentary elections coming up, it just added an extra urgency to the whole investigation to really find out who are the people who are representing farmers. Do farmers feel represented? And who are the power brokers when it comes to talking about farm and farming in Europe?
Amazing. Thanks, Tin. And Klaas, over to you. Can you walk me through what was your idea also on the inception of Desert Dump? So what were the key things you wanted to know from the outset?
For a long time, I wanted to do an investigation to see what Europe's migration policies looks like in Northern Africa. So the EU, European countries, they have been financing what they call migration policies, migration management in countries outside Europe in order to manage migration, as they call it. And that's for hundreds of millions of euros going into these countries. But what's actually happening on the ground is not really visible and to a large extent unknown. And when we did an investigation into what's known as the Melilla massacre 2 years ago, when a lot of people were trying to cross from Morocco into Spain, and during that attempt, dozens of people died. The survivors of these attempts, they were put into large buses and driven south, and then they were reportedly basically left in the middle of nowhere by the Moroccan security forces. And that was the start of looking into this phenomenon and to see whether this was happening in other countries as well. And then we pretty quickly discovered that this same kind of method was happening or was being used in countries like Tunisia and Mauritania. And what we wanted to know was how much of this was known to the EU, to European countries, and was the EU in any way involved in this with equipment, with finance, with security forces. So yeah, that's how it all started.
And Klaas, you mentioned it briefly now, but what were the main findings that came out of the investigation?
So what we figured out was that Europe is directly involved, financing, providing equipment, security forces to Northern African countries to arrest, detain, and dump people from sub-Saharan countries into the desert or remote areas and leave them there without food and water. And this is a system that is going on in the three countries I already mentioned, so in Tunisia, and Morocco, and in Mauritania. And people that this happens to, that's around tens of thousands of people per year. And so to give maybe some quick examples of the findings per country is that, for example, in Morocco, we discovered that there are paramilitary forces active in the coastal cities, and they have plainclothes agents who are scouting the streets for anyone that's black, and they're arresting people. They put them in the back of a van, and then they drive them to a police station, and then from the police station it goes with buses to remote areas where they leave them. In Mauritania, it works exactly the same, only that it's the Spanish police and the Spanish Guardia Civil who are working directly with the Mauritanian forces to arrest people on the street. Then they have access to the detention center, they photograph people, and then they receive lists of people to be deported to places like Mali, where there is active fighting going on. And in Tunisia, they skip the detention part, but in Tunisia, they drive them directly to the borders with Libya or Algeria. And most of the time, they leave the people in the desert. Other times, those people are being handed over to Libyan militias or border forces, and then people are being tortured for ransom, or they are being trafficked to other gangs, or they are being forced to work.
Thanks, Klaas. Yeah, and we got some harrowing footage, which we'll talk about later, that got a lot of pickup and media coverage. Finn, can you talk through a bit of the union's top lines as well, please?
Yeah, so we sort of looked into farm unions, right, and farm protest leaders in 4 different countries: France, Poland, Italy, and Germany. And what we found was that, representation of farmers is actually concentrated in the hands of a few people. And these few people, either leaders of farm unions or people who have been leading the farmers' protests, they actually have very little semblance to their constituents. So, for example, they have vast amounts of land, and they hold multiple positions on the boards of agribusinesses, or they run their own big agribusinesses. They also tend to have very close links with big ag, which means big agriculture. These are big, large-scale industrial companies and farms. And a lot of the times, their interests, of this big agribusinesses and big ag companies their interests tend to be quite different to those of farmers, right? And this in particular could create conflicts of interest with their mandate, because they're supposed to be representing all farmers, big and small, successful and struggling. But if they have stakes in companies or businesses that actually benefit from, for example, giving low prices to farmers, or selling pesticides and fertilizers at a higher price to farmers, that's a clear conflict of interest, right? We also found that some of them are amongst the highest earners in their profession. They also many of them also either directly control or own shares in media outlets that cater to the agriculture community. And what that means is, of course, that allows them to spread and amplify their messages. We've also actually found that, worryingly, some of these power brokers use verbal threats, online harassment, and or lawsuits to silence their critics. And these tend to be journalists, environmentalists, and often also include farmers and ordinary citizens. So the findings, essentially, in a nutshell, really raise questions about farmer representation in some of Europe's largest agriculture economies.
Yeah, and they're important questions, I think, with farming being such a big issue on the EU election agenda as well. So I guess both of these investigations actually took place in the context of wanting to contribute to quite, big and important discussions that were already happening in a quite prevalent way across European media. And that was EU border externalization and what that looks like, and also farmer protests. But I think it can be quite difficult to do this for investigative journalism to actually contribute to current and active discussions, given the slow pace of investigations. So I want to understand from both of you about how you go about constructing an investigation that achieves that. So, Klaas, you mentioned that this issue had been kind of reported on before, so that the human rights violations that occurred due to border externalization was quite, I guess, well known to policymakers and advocates. But this investigation that we published a few weeks ago was the first time that we collected visual evidence of these dumps happening in a kind of systematic way. And also, I guess, was really able to prove that they were using racial profiling to do this, which hadn't been part of the discussion before. So how did you go about constructing that narrative, and why was the visual evidence so important there?
I think you're absolutely right, Tessa. It is known in European circles. There have been stories throughout the summer, actually, on Tunisia dumping people in the desert with Libya. Less so on Morocco and Mauritania, but if you look for it, there have been the reports for the last decades almost. But what hasn't been done before until now was to prove that this is some kind of system that's going on and that this is working in all of the three countries exactly or almost identical. And that is what I wanted to do with this, and then to also demonstrate that Europe knows about this and is funding it and supporting it, despite the human rights violations that are going on and that are happening with EU money. Then what we found out during the investigation was that it's not only targeting people who are refugees or asylum seekers or people who might want to go migrate towards Europe. And don't get me wrong, that's bad enough, but it is targeting all people who are Black. And that could also be, there are thousands of people working in Northern African countries who are coming from sub-Saharan countries and have work permits, visa, there were tourists. All of these people could be picked up from the streets like any day, at any moment. We spoke to a number of people who didn't dare to go out during the day anymore because they were afraid of being picked up while they were buying groceries. So yeah, that is, I think, the new element to this investigation, to prove that this is a system and these are not incidents. And in order to really demonstrate that, it is extremely important, we think, to do that with visual evidence, because unfortunately, it matters who says what. When refugees or asylum seekers tell their story, people will not necessarily believe that that's happening, unfortunately. So in these instances, it actually matters to have the visual evidence to prove that this is going on, and then link the visual evidence to EU funding and European taxpayers' money.
Yeah, that's terrible. And I think that visual evidence, I guess, really speaks to the kind of values that are behind these strategies and behind the kind of public money that's going to these operations as well. So Finn, in many ways, the farming investigation is kind of the opposite of the desert dumps investigation, which was the collection of evidence for, I think, over a year or around a year. I remember in our newsroom, we were seeing lots of farmers' protests picking up a lot of steam earlier this year, and we were having kind of strategic discussions on how could we build on our previous investigation from last year about farmer representation, but also capitalize on this, huge media momentum of covering farmer protests in Europe. And I think from that coverage, it was super clear that farmers were really unhappy and that something needs to change. But when it came to, the demands of those protests and whose demands were actually getting pursued in the decision-making spaces, I think it became a lot more murky. So how did our investigation seek to clarify this?
Yeah, and I think, Tessa, you're right. I think this might be one of the shortest investigations we've done in the Food Systems newsroom. The Copa Cogeca ones from the inception to finish was, I think, about a year. This one was just a little bit over 2 to 3 months. I think there's been a very unfortunate narrative that has developed, which is, farmers versus a society that cares for the environment and for nature, or that farmers are against nature and the environment. And I think that is not true. And what we have tried to show with this investigation is that the people who have access to the halls of power do not necessarily represent the people out on the streets. The investigation didn't sort of purse through the demands of the farmers' protests, but I've been following this now for months. And, if you just look at them, they are calling for a few different things. The protests are very country specific, but there are commonalities. They want more support, less bureaucracy, and they want a fair income. Now, some of the environmental policies are associated with that, particularly around the bureaucratic measures. But things like fairer income, things like more support, things talking about trade deals, for example, there are a lot of concerns from European farmers that some of these trade deals that are being signed will bring in imports that have much lower standards, whether they be environmental or social, compared to what European farmers have to abide by. So the demands are varied, yet the policy response and the push that we've seen from a lot of these powerful people have all been about, oh no, this is a backlash against environmental policy. We need to dismantle the green policies. And I think that is a problem. The coverage and the response of the farmers' protests have been oversimplified. And I hope that the findings will make people realize and ask questions, right? Next time somebody says, I'm speaking on behalf of farmers, or if a politician says, I am going to help the farmers, which farmers are they exactly talking about? And who do they actually represent?
You're listening to Backlight, Lighthouse Report's monthly deep dive into the elusive world of investigative journalism. If you want to know more about our investigations, you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. Or if you have suggestions on who we can talk to on this podcast, you can reach out to us at backlight@lighthousereports.com.
So, Klaas, back to you. I remember in the early chats and our early kind of meetings with all the partners on desert dumps, we had discussed that we'd want the investigation to come out close to the European elections. And obviously a big part and valuable evidence that we got was all the internal documents, either through FOIA or sources that really showed kind of the complicity and the awareness of either EU agencies or people inside the EU in different capacities of these dumps. So I wanted to ask you, as the European parliamentary elections are coming up this week, what do you hope that voters and policymakers will take away from the findings of the investigation?
I think that a lot of people in Europe are concerned about migration, whether they're right or not. They see it as an issue, and they want to see that Europe, the EU, is doing something about it. But I also believe that a lot of people would like to know what that actually means. And therefore, I think it is important that they realize that these kind of desert dumps, so that Northern African countries leaving people literally in the desert without any help. So I do think it is important that people realize that this is what the EU does with their money. And this is the migration policy that they voted for in the past and maybe will vote for again. I believe that a lot of people do not agree with this kind of policy, and that they are concerned about migration, but that this is not the solution. It's very ineffective, but it's happening far away from their own homes, far away from Europe, in very remote areas. It's hard to access, and that's why I think it is important to tell these kind of stories.
And then for you, for the union's investigation, what are the takeaways that you hope voters and policymakers take from those findings?
At the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'd like voters to sort of, to be a bit more questioning when a politician, or political party say that they're supporting farmers, they're the party of farmers, they're the politician for farmers. Which farmers are they actually supporting? Which policies are they supporting? Are they really going to be, helping the small scale family farmers, farmers that I think a lot of us think we are protecting, helping when we talk about rural areas, when we talk about farming and food production? Or are they actually helping big, large-scale industrial monoculture kind of food production and, kind of farmers that they're going to be supporting? And, I'd also like the findings to contribute to hopefully a wider and more nuanced debate around farmer protests and why they're angry and how best it is to support them instead of an us versus them. I was listening to Klaas just talking about the desert dumps, and I think, what's happening there is absolutely harrowing. And he is right, because it is happening so far away from European, viewers and ordinary people. Sometimes it's hard to, sort of place yourself in there. And I'm hoping, food and farming being such an important part of our everyday lives, right? We eat twice a day, 3 times a day, that people think beyond just what's on their plate and about the people that make this plate of food possible. and asking a bit more questions around the power imbalances and inequalities of our food producers and farmers.
Klaas, I know the investigation has already made waves through the media internationally, even though it just came out a fortnight ago. And Beatriz, I saw you were on TV on both the BBC and RTVE in Spain. And Klaas, you were on the radio in the Netherlands and also on the BBC's Focus in Africa. But are you able to talk a little bit about the early impact in the last few weeks?
Yeah, of course. Like you said, it had a huge coverage around the world, basically. And it was picked up by large media. And we had, of course, great media partners already involved in the investigation. But other than that, civil society organizations engaged with it, shared it, talked about it. We got invitations to speak at various events. We will speak to policymakers and politicians about this. There were groups, civil society organizations that followed up on it with their own content, or research organizations. And yeah, like you said, it will take time to see any change. But if I have learned one thing in the last couple of years, is that if you want to have a chance of real impact in terms of policy or within the EU, then linking it to EU funding and the potential misuse of EU funding, that is really that the European Commission is scared about. And if there is a potential fraud going on, then there are institutions in Europe that are really independent and can start an investigation. And that's what they will try to avoid.
Yeah, and already the investigation has gotten quite a big response from a lot of candidates running in the EU election. I remember one even responded in a public debate saying, that this really wasn't aligned with European values. And, while those statements aren't necessarily kind of impact or tangible change themselves, I think it's reason why the election of those people is so important, because they can carry through those mandates of change. And then we can start seeing those, I guess, bigger structural changes based on, the findings that investigations like this are able to uncover.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Klaas and Thin, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I know it's been an exhausting few weeks, to say the least. Pushing the investigations over the line is never an easy task, and especially to do so with quite a big deadline and corralling so many media partners. So thank you so much to both of you for your time.
Well, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
And just to wrap up with a question that we ask all of our interviewees. So with journalists facing threats from layoffs to censorship, what's a moment that made you think this is why public interest journalism matters?
One of the people that we interviewed for Desert Dumps was a guy named Francois. He's a musician from Cameroon and had to leave his country for some bizarre reasons, because he was threatened to be killed in his neighborhood, and he walked all the way to Tunisia. And there he tried to go to Europe together with his wife and his stepson, but he got intercepted like 4 times and dumped in the desert twice. And this person doesn't have the possibility necessarily to tell his story to politicians, to the people that are in power, to ordinary people across Europe. But he was saying exactly the right things by saying, look, this is not Tunisia that is stopping the people, and well, they're implementing the system, but it's the EU behind it. And he said, well, the EU, they can try to stop migration, but in 1,000 or 10,000 years from now, there will be still a person like Francois, there still be a person like him who is not at home and who is going somewhere and following his dream or seeking safety, or this Europe is blocking the ways that things are supposed to be. That was what he was saying. And for me, that is one of maybe the most important motivation to do journalism, to tell these kind of stories, because I do believe that if everybody had the opportunity to visit either an area where these things are happening or a conflict area, then the world would have been or would be a different place. but that's not possible. So I see it as my job as a journalist to bring part of these worlds to Europe and to other places in the world, so that we know from each other and that we realize what is going on.
Yeah, I would say my answer is also quite similar to Klaas, even though, our investigation is very much rooted in Europe. I think, totally agree with Klaas. I think a lot of journalists get into this job to sort of give voice to the voiceless. I know it sounds super cliche, but I think it is true for a lot of us. And, so many of our media partners, as well as myself, when we were doing this investigation, as well as last year's into Kopa Gojeka, we spoke to so many farmers and also ordinary people, particularly, ordinary people who've been affected by some of these large scale industrial farming projects, or, smaller scale farmers who are just, who cares about their land, cares about their animal, and wants to feed their local communities. So many people were so scared. They didn't want to go on the record. They were scared because they didn't have the power, the same kind of power, the same kind of resources, the same kind of influence compared to the people and the groups that we were investigating. And they were extremely helpful. They gave us great insights into the kind of challenges that they were facing. But, time and again, whenever I hear an interviewee I'm speaking to or a media partner came back to us and said, yes, we have this great testimonies, but we can't, they have to be anonymous because people are too scared. They have so much more to lose. And I think that's, just really drive home this knowledge of why we're doing what we're doing, so that we can help people who don't have a voice be able to share the problems that they're facing, the challenge that they're facing. And hopefully something will come out of it. Hopefully policymakers will see it and want to change their laws and regulations. Hopefully other people will read it, feel, empathy and want to join forces, or just feel less lonely thinking, I'm not the only farmer facing this problem. And hopefully we can start to move the needle to transform our food systems and help our farmers.
Yeah, I think those are great answers, because I think, at the heart of these kinds of big structural investigations are, a collection of individual experiences and individual stories. And I think, the reason why exposing systemic problems like this is so important is because people are at the heart of these investigations. So I think that was great to bring it back to that.
Thank you for listening. You can follow us on our social media. Our Twitter and Blue Sky accounts are @LHReports, and you can also reach out to us on email. Our email is backlight@lighthousereports.com, and all of these accounts are linked in the show notes.
Yes, and you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, everyone, and happy voting.